We talk about immortality a lot on this channel, and one of the concerns that I hear about most often in the comment sections is the question of wealth. The contention is that immortality treatment would only be available to the richest people in society, and so not only would they just keep on accumulating more wealth and power, but also have an additional means of controlling the rest of us. This becomes especially concerning when you consider the fact that immortality is not going to be you just take a pill and then you stop aging. If you want a more in-depth look at the science behind immortality, do check out my The 7 Keys of Immortality video. But essentially it's more an array of various simple to complex treatments that are used on the body in order to rejuvenate it, where natural mechanisms that the body already has to do that fail. And of course, because we've seen a lot of dystopian sci-fi fiction and we do live in a world that is arguably very much disproportionately controlled by the richest of the rich, it's a natural conclusion that we would jump to. In most of the world, the best medicine available is only available to the people who have the most money. Even in some countries with like socialized healthcare or partially socialized healthcare, oftentimes very rich people will get preferential treatment or first access to like the top shelf super expensive stuff. But I've also talked about how products with such a universal demand would see a very quick scale up in production and massive amounts of money sunk into R&D costs in order to make them cheaper and more efficiently distributed. If you have a product that you can sell significantly more of, albeit at a lower profit margin, you're still ultimately making more money. So if you're smart, that's what you do. Even if someone tried to monopolize immortality, which is unlikely in the first place because these treatments are so disparate that they would most likely be developed in completely different types of healthcare organizations, but even if that did happen, governments would be very quick to respond to that by just dissolving the monopoly. You know, it's in the public interest because they don't want to be torn to shreds by their constituents. Because let me tell you, you're not going to have to put in a lot of market research in order to ask people whether or not they want to live longer. We already pay a lot of money to live longer, and this isn't additional centuries as someone who is biologically young. This is like an additional week chained to the hospital bed in agony type living. Diseases of old age are essentially just what happens as you age. And we spend a lot of money in order to treat people who have these things to prolong their lives. If you get to make people negligibly senescent, you don't have to worry about these anymore, because by definition you have cured them. So essentially, the array of treatments that you would need in order to be negligibly senescent would only have to be cheaper than whatever you would otherwise be spending on diseases of old age. And I'm not going to use American numbers for this because American healthcare is just fucked up and weird. You have the highest spending, terrible quality of care, terrible health outcomes, predatory fucking industries. It's not our proper healthcare system that functions like works. The NHS in England spends on a person that is 65 years old 2.5 times as much as it does on a person that is 30 years old. And when you increase the age to 85, they spend more than 5 times as much as they do per annum on a 30-year-old. In 2013-14, the NHS spent around £1,500 on every person aged around 30, and even less than that on 20-year-olds. Starting at around 50, healthcare costs just exploded, maxing out at around £7,500 per person for 85-year-olds. That's a difference of £6,000. So if the immortality treatments cost less than £6,000 per year, the NHS would save a lot of money by giving them to these old people. In 2015, the German healthcare system spent around 23 million euros on 15 to 30-year-olds, as opposed to the over 168 million it spent on people over 65. That's a difference of 145 million euros. And if for that money you can cover all the people over 65 in Germany with negligible senescence treatments, that's the economically smart thing to do. And the situation is not much different in other developed countries. Worse even in some like Japan and Korea, who would save even more money. And the amount of old people is only set to increase dramatically over the coming decades. You can probably look up the numbers for your own country, but do consider that very often these numbers don't even account for the cost of putting old people up in appropriate care facilities, and almost never do they account for the immense economic cost of people staying home to care for their elderly family members instead of going to work. So that's already a huge budget that we have for potential biogerontological treatments. However, that is by far not the only way that old people are a massive drain on state expenditure and the economy. Not only do they drop out of the workforce, but they also cost billions upon billions in pensions. In 2017, the United Kingdom was spending £111 billion on old age pensions. In Germany, it's around 200 billion euros. So while healthcare savings alone might be enough to stem the cost of negligible senescence therapies, the amount of money that we could save on pensions for old people who would just easily be able to rejoin the workforce dwarfs that. And even if this happened somewhat slowly, it would still be a massive paradigm shift, because you'd suddenly have tens of millions of people who are highly qualified and experienced rejoining the labor pool. Because of the way that most pension systems work, there would of course have to be a certain degree of payouts and time agreements. Imagine paying into like these state-run pension funds for decades, and then you turn 65, you retire, next year they come out with Immortality and they use pension money to pay for you becoming young again and staying young forever. You'd probably still be a bit miffed about losing all of that money. And of course, many of these old people, especially the ones who have been in retirement for a long time, would have to be retrained into new professions because their old professions maybe don't exist anymore or have changed dramatically, and would at least require some acclimatization period to readjust to the new labor market. You also have to consider that at this point, much of the labor force would probably already just be robots, which does of course increase the carrying capacity you have as a society for specialists and standard of living overall. Historically, this kind of thing has pretty much always resulted in what you might call a golden age, but this paradigm shift is so massive that no one can really definitively predict all its outcomes. You would of course have an unprecedented amount of genius and experience in the labor pool. Imagine a scientist that's been doing this one type of research for like 100 years. Imagine how good they are at that. Now, of course, all of this still kind of affects primarily the richest people in the world, aka the Western world. Though this is still at least a few decades away and geopolitics may have changed dramatically in that time frame, many of the poor countries don't even have functional socialized healthcare systems, they don't have socialized proper pension systems that function, and many of them are just too politically unstable for any of that shit in the first place. And frankly, that's a problem for which I have no solution. I can, with reasonable certainty, predict that biological immortality will be widespread in Europe long before it is in Africa. That is an unfortunate reality that the future will have to deal with. It will eventually come there also through like the shared prosperity of globalization, which, you know, granted, it's probably not going to be immortality that will be the driving force of bringing that kind of prosperity to the poorer countries in the world, but other futuristic technologies that we will probably be benefiting from at that point in time, such as, for instance, nuclear fusion, increased automation, and also potentially the space exploitation rush. So ultimately, there isn't just a massive economic incentive to have immortality be a thing, but in the Western world, it may well actually be like the only thing that saves our welfare systems from strangling us and saves our societies from drowning in old people. And in conjunction with other technological developments, it might actually be the thing that catapults us into an unprecedented utopian age, albeit probably one with its own problems. robots. You'd probably have like a generation of young people who have no way of competing with the elderly anymore because they're just more qualified and they're just as physically healthy, though we'd probably also have the resources to keep them into prolonged education. Barring an ability to just drastically increase people's intelligence, which may well be possible, we have the problem that there'll probably be a large population of people that can't be trained into any of the professions that are still available, because all low-skill labor will have been taken by robots. Though once again, we would have the resources to make sure they have a comfortable and possibly even productive life. And obviously nobody would be running out of time anymore. If things change for the better, which they probably will at some point, they will be around to see it and take advantage of it. Meaning, I think, is going to be one of the major issues of the future, especially if you add post-scarcity to the whole thing. I think probably mostly through post-scarcity. I would predict a big rise in the number of cults, or potentially political extremism, probably both, though also with an increased amount of safe outlets for these kinds of energies. Listen, if anyone tries to sell you like a perfect world in the future, a utopia that doesn't have problems, they're lying to you. But, you know, all that being said, ultimately, fully automated luxury gay space communism, here we come. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities. I touched on a lot of different subjects in this video, especially towards the end, because this is a very, very large complex of topics. So do check out my other videos, or maybe go to Isaac Arthur's channel in order to find out more about these various other technologies. In the meantime, you can consider buying some of my merchandise or the book that I have written, or also supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar. And in that spirit, consider that it's not unlikely that you will actually be biologically immortal, which doesn't mean that you won't die. That's one of the big bullshit arguments that I have also made videos on. And see you around, cunts!